Thank you for joining us at the 2022 edition of Expo Chicago, the International Exposition of Contemporary and Modern Art. I'm Kate Sears-Butowski, Director of Programming. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to the Dialogue stage, presented in partnership with the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. Dialogues offers panel discussions, conversations, and provocative artistic discourse with leading artists, curators, designers, and arts professionals on the current issues that engage them. In this conversation, The Education of the Unartist, Part 1, Front International's 2022 Artistic Director, Prem Krishnamurthy, joins participants Camila Janan Rashid, digitally, and Sarah Oppenheimer to explore the edges of contemporary artistic practice and ask what we need to learn to make creative work more sustainable now and in the future. A special thank you to our partners, Front International, Joyce Foundation, and Pigment. Please join us in welcoming Prem, who will introduce Camila and Sarah.
Well, thank you everyone for coming today. It's wonderful to see so many folks here in the dialogue stage. I'm Prem Krishnamurthy, and this is a great opportunity. It's been wonderful to be in Chicago and to talk with so many people about Front International, the triennial of contemporary art that's happening in Cleveland, Akron, and Oberlin from July 14th to October 2nd. And what I can say just in the forefront is that Front is a massive collaboration. It happens across 25 venues in Northeast Ohio and involves so many partners, from the different artists who are involved in it, the institutions and presenting venues, as well as all of these different communities in these three cities and further flung with whom artists are working. I want to just say a quick note of thanks, first of all, to Kate, Jamie, Ryan, and the whole Expo team for putting on this event. I also want to give a big shout out to Allison, Sarah, Fred, and the Front team for the booth that they've put together. If you haven't checked it out, it is number 287, all the way in the back near the VIP lounge. There is work by Lorraine Lynn, who is here with us, and other artists. So I hope you'll have a chance to check it out. So, a couple of words about Front before we start out. The exhibition is called Oh Gods of Dust and Rainbows, and it's an exhibition focused on art as an agent of transformation, a mode of healing, and a form of therapy. Now, this title, it comes from a 1957 poem by Langston Hughes, who grew up, spent many of his teenage years in Cleveland, and produced some of his first plays at Cleveland's Karamu House. Now, we announced the title and theme of this show in January of 2020, just before the onset of the pandemic and all of the other calls for social equity and racial social transformation that have happened in our world amidst all of the other crises that are happening. So what this is borne out in many ways is that the idea of art as a transformative tool, as an agent of healing, is something that we need to think even more about. The exhibition thinks about this on three levels: the level of the individual, the level of the collective, and on the level of structures, social structures. And these play themselves out in ideas like daily practice, the way in which art as an individual tool can be liberatory. It can be a form of meditation, therapy, and transformation. To the idea of sharing joy, how art and the aesthetic pleasure that art, movement, music, and other modalities offer, that they can bring different people together, people across lines of difference. And the third is the question of speaking with power, how art can start to influence the ways that we live and the structures, both visible and invisible, that underlie contemporary experience. So, in the spirit of both daily practice and sharing joy, we've put together this panel today with two amazing individuals, Camila Janan Rashid and Sarah Oppenheimer. I've had the privilege to know both of them and have long conversations over the last years. This panel is called The Education of the Unartist, Part 1. It comes from a series of essays by Alan Capro that were written in the late 1960s and early 1970s, which I've been reading and rereading over the last 25 years. And in many ways, it is a prompt to think about what is art's role in a broader sense? How does it move beyond the walls of a museum or an art fair and become part of everyday life? And I think that both of these individuals, Camila and Sarah, offer exemplary practices that move beyond disciplinary boundaries to think about art in much more porous and future-facing ways. So in just a moment, we'll bring them onto the virtual and physical stage to have a conversation and start a dialogue. Because one thing that is important is that neither Sarah nor Camila have met each other before. And I think that opportunities like this, stages like this, are meant exactly for the kind of dialogues between people which might not happen otherwise. So I'm excited to start a new conversation here. But before we begin, actually, last week in Cleveland, we announced our artist list in a couple of very large-scale initiatives. We announced a big mural that Julie Moretu will be creating as her first public artwork in downtown Cleveland, a 100-foot building, the Standard Building. Yeah. And we also announced the Art Futures Fellowship, which is a program spearheaded by Deidre McPherson, the head of community initiatives at Front, a 3-year program for artists based in Northeast Ohio who are BIPOC artists to receive $25,000 in unrestricted funding towards their artistic careers, as well as professional development and all kinds of other support. So it's really thinking about art in the long term and how art can change the contexts and the structures that we live in. But one of the things that also came out of that event in Cleveland last week was that we asked people to brainstorm in small groups with people they didn't know, one way, one action, small or large, that they could think of how art could begin to transform the world in bigger or smaller ways. And here's something that we received via email from an artist named Cadence Pearson Lane, who is based in Oberlin. And so she said, what is one thing we all could do? And she says, I shy away from the microphone, so she chose not to share it as a group. But she said, well, I would like to talk to our local schools and ask the teachers to start each day with 15 minutes, or at the least 5 minutes, of creative activity. This would be free for everyone to interpret as they desire. It could be a private journal or sketchbook, not for anyone to look at, just to experience for yourself each day, no critique, no judgment. And I thought that that was a fantastic idea, a fantastic way to start a dialogue, start a process of learning with individual reflection and individual expression. So before we go any further, I think there have been maybe Jamie has been handing out pieces of paper. Does everyone have a notebook or a piece of paper or a pen or a phone? Anybody who doesn't, just raise your hand. Grab something that you can just write on, doodle on, draw on, jot down some thoughts. I think somebody's got their hand raised right over there. Great. And I'm also going to do this. I'll just invite you to take 5 minutes to spend some time with your own thoughts, to write or draw or do whatever is meaningful, or maybe to think about what you're curious about, what brought you here today, so that we all start by grounding ourselves in our own individual practice. And I see Jamie, somebody over here. So. Okay. Great. So, without further ado, I'd love to invite onto the virtual stage Camila Janan Rashid and Sarah Oppenheimer. Can we have a round of applause for them? Hi, Camila. Great to see you out in the universe there. Sarah.
Hello.
Well, thank you both for joining today. I mean, I think that one of the great privileges of this role as artistic director front is to be able to be in dialogue with minds and humans whom I admire so much. I think, I've known both of you for different periods of time, but I've had the pleasure to work with you over the last years on Front. This panel is really focused on the development of this idea of an artist. And I'm curious, both of you have already in your practices a particular way of talking about what you do. For example, Sarah, in some of your bios, you call yourself an architectural manipulator. And I think that's a fascinating term in terms of how you see your role as an actor in the world and the things that you're creating. Camila, I know that oftentimes you refer to yourself as a learner who works between all of these different contexts. And can you hear us okay, Camila? One of the great things about our world is that there's always a little bit of bumpiness, a little bit of friction that slows us down, and it gives us a moment to respond. So maybe I'll start, Sarah, with this question of, you actually asked me before a good question. I'm curious about why this piece of writing by Allan Kaprow. You had a chance to look at it too. I'm curious what your response was.
So I was really interested in how Kaprow was grappling with what he terms as non-art. And it made me pause and sort of reconsider how this notion has evolved into our present day, and what does it mean to take stock of the complexity of the world around us and to somehow negotiate the practice of doing things that we may or may not call art in response to or within the universe of the world, if that makes any sense.
Totally. So much of your work takes place in things that are considered institutions, whether it's museums or art venues or other spaces, but in which you change the rules of play, as it were, in which you introduce elements or instruments that people can manipulate, which transform that space, they change the experience and also give people a direct sense of agency within that. But I'm interested because so much of that does happen within the context of an artistic institution or this kind of frame in which you're active. And you're also active as an educator within the art context as well. And that's where we first met, actually, when you were a graduate student and I was a little undergrad, and we were the two people using a computer lab in the 1990s.
Yes, I think that you're raising a very interesting point. And to turn to this notion of an architectural manipulator, I believe that we find ourselves constantly in a state, in an environment that we find to some degree inflexible and non-responsive to us. And I'm extremely interested in setting up the conditions whereby we as inhabitants of this environment have a sense of agency in reshaping this pre-existing condition.
It is also really interesting in the context of something like an art fair, where it feels like so many things are happening, so many structures are there that are invisible, that or are fixed. I mean, as a visitor to an art fair, your one mode is to look at things or to consume them, but there's not necessarily a lot of agency in terms of the rearrangement of it. And so I think that that's a kind of interesting position that you're making about, that you're pointing out about how the world, we often see the world as being, it's the structures that underlie things, whether they're algorithms, whether they're social structures, economic structures, are mostly invisible. And oftentimes, as an individual, you don't feel like there are ways that you can change them, or at least I can speak from my perspective. I mean, Camila, I'm curious because so much of your work comes out of your practice also as an educator, as somebody who has taken an extremely non-normative, non-traditional path into the world of visual art, but it also has begun to engage with many of these questions of systems and algorithms within our life. So I'm curious if you can say a little bit about how you relate to this practice as a quote-unquote artist.
Yeah, so I always tell this story of how a couple of years ago, I just sort of suddenly stopped sort of referring to myself as an artist and started referring to myself as a learner. And I can't really pinpoint what exactly prompted that, but I knew there was something within me that needed something else to describe what I was doing that implied some type of like relationship to all the knowledge that was being produced by humans, by other species and other galaxies. That didn't just put me in a position of creating something for an audience, but allowed me a certain sense of, I would say, humility to actually sit back and like look at things being revised and to accept a certain level of uncertainty. And so I think that as I thought about the reading itself and I thought about sort of like my role as an educator, I think one of the questions that kept coming up to me is sort of a question around what can and can't be taught. And one of my students at Cooper sort of brought this up to me because they were saying, we're learning all this stuff in your class about teaching and how to teach and what does it mean to sort of think about pedagogy as something that's play oriented, all these things, right? But they're like, but how am I actually going to be prepared to be a teacher? And so one of the things that we sort of like landed on is that so much of teaching, which I consider to be like an extreme sport of improvisation and emotional wrangling when you're working in high schools. So much of that is actually not about what you've learned before, but about your ability and willingness to do close listening and to be responsive. And so I think as I thought about the reading, I kept thinking about words around relationality and ecosystems, but also around sort of my desire to operate in the world as a person who is a strong listener and can be responsive versus reactive and has the ability to improvise and be flexible as new information is revealed to me, as new circumstances sort of arise. And so I sort of thought about this text in terms of like the education of the artist and thinking about what actually can you educate someone towards? Is it content? Is it values? Is it ethos? What can you educate someone towards? And what does it mean to sort of ready or prepare yourself to be an artist? And how all those different pathways, I'll say particularly for myself, we're not rooted in going to art school. I went to school for policy and have a master's degree in secondary education. So I sort of came at this as a person who was deeply interested in how people process information. And so I think in my practice, I'm always trying to sort of create environments that allow for people to play with different ways of revealing or concealing information or processing information.
I'm curious, is there, can I just see a show of hands? Are there any people here who think of themselves as teachers in one form or another? Yeah, good number. And how many of you think of yourselves also as listeners or learners? Okay, the whole room. That's great. No, I think this question of listening as a practice and also it comes back to almost the idea of the senses, the idea of how, as humans, we interface with things, how we create a dialogue, whether it's with other humans or with other systems or with other materials. I mean, Sarah, I know that you've also, in your teaching, been thinking a lot about the sensitive instruments or the idea of different ways of interacting with the human apparatus.
So I was describing just earlier today that in the course of developing my own sort of inquiry, I have used a process of learning which is deeply ingrained in a process of teaching, and developed a workshop format which I was holding at the Yale School of Art. And the workshop that has been sort of most seminal recently has been something that was titled The Sensitive Machine, or Sensitive Machine, in which a set of discrete bodies, discrete people came together and sort of constructed physical prosthetic extensions which were collectively controlled. And the learning that I was involved in through this process translated into an exhibition that was at the Wellen Museum of Art by the same title, Sensitive Machine, and has subsequently and currently driven my inquiries henceforth. And to say something about that in particular, I think that the specific possibility of a sensate collective self where we share, I'm looking at a field of people who are all seated next to each other quite closely, where you have a sense of the body that is next to you, you have a sense of how when they shift their weight, it affects the position of your chair. As they move close to you, perhaps you move away. There's a kind of receptive collective body that we are now occupying. And I'm extremely interested in that as a responsive ecosystem, Camila, as you are describing. And I'm extremely interested in how that can translate into a very self-conscious process in kind of bracketed through what we are calling or might be called art.
Camila, is there anything, I'm curious also, you've talked about your own teaching, and I'm curious how those approaches or ideas might relate to your own past practice as a teacher and your current practice, the things that you're asking with your students.
Yeah, I think, Sarah, as you were speaking, a lot of what you were saying resonated, because I think in this project that you're describing, which I have not had the pleasure of seeing or experiencing, I'm reminded of a conversation around choreography that I had, I think when I was in Vancouver 3 or 4 years ago, and we were talking about the relationship between choreography and compliance, and this dancer was talking about sort of their resistance to choreography. And I started to think more about that when I was putting on this workshop at the Brooklyn Public Library, where folks were invited to use sort of the residue of what folks had left behind to either create a dance or a poem or create a song. And in the dance workshop, one of the things that happened is that Brass Burlesque, which is the burlesque group here in Brooklyn, co-facilitated, and we were talking about the notion of choreography and what if we sort of thought about dance less as everyone doing the same thing at the same time, and more about dance being ecosystemic, which means that everyone is dancing with an awareness of other people in the space in relationship to one another. So I may move my arm to the left, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're required to, but it will mean that you need to move your body in a way that considers my presence in the space. And likewise, I consider my presence in the space as well. And so I think that a lot of these things help me think through how I think about myself as a learner, as a person who wants to be able to move in a sort of shifting space and be listening and watching and engaging closely enough to notice those changes and be responsive. But I think also with my students, one of the things that's happened during this semester is students talking about being burnt out and exhausted and needing support in the ways that we've collectively used our time during each of our sessions to literally revisit the syllabus to say, like, which of these things is actually necessary for our learning, and which of these things are more organized around a performance of compliance or a performance of productivity. And so one of the things that feels important to me as an educator, learner, person, facilitating learning for other people is to constantly think about those micro moments where I can slow down to actually say, what exactly am I doing and why? What are my expectations of the people in the space with me? And am I thinking about it as a community or ecosystem of learners, or is this about a unidirectional exchange? And so I think, again, as Sarah's describing this project, I'm just getting really excited about the ways of working and being in the world that are relational and that are about acknowledging other people as dependents on us, but also how our actions and our ways of moving impact other people, and how we design artistic spaces that are ecosystemic, that ask for people to visit multiple locations within a space as a way to read and make sense of the space, versus sort of these singular moments of looking at a thing and moving on, looking at a thing that then prompts you, and in the language of Octavia Butler, sort of a primitive hypertext that sends you from thing to thing. So I think if I'm answering your question, I've been thinking a lot about choreography and movement in relation to learning, and the importance of reading and learning as an embodied experience. So something that you're just not doing with your eyes, but something you're doing with your entire body, which requires that artists are thinking specifically about how they're making use of space and architecture to facilitate a certain type of play that is less rooted in the performance of play, but rooted in actual play.
I think that what you're describing is really fascinating, and I want to say a little bit more about the possibility of manipulating architecture or choreography, because I think that there's a possible fallacy in focusing on being an architectural manipulator, insofar as the challenge is not so much to manipulate, the challenge is to set up the conditions whereby others and all of us have an understanding of our own interrelated and sort of our own interrelated responsiveness and agency, both tied intimately together. And Camila, something I'm
absolutely. I think, yeah, absolutely. And I think that, first of all, this is very difficult, but also fun, because I want to look at everyone's face and nod and give sort of gestures of affirmation. So just know that I'm affirming, even though I'm behind you. Yes to everything you just said. And I think what most excites me is this reminder. And I had this hard conversation with students last week, and it's a conversation I had with myself when I first became a high school teacher, which is, what is actually my responsibility? And I think I came into teaching at 2021 being like, I'm coming into teaching to do X, Y, and Z, to do X, Y, and Z, to do this, to do that. And I think that the really important moment of pause was recognizing that my responsibility, what I'm asserting as my responsibility, is to create, as you said, the conditions for other people to play, the conditions for other people to manipulate, the conditions for other people to go in multiple directions, to do multiple reads, to come in and out of the space, right? Because I believe that when you come into art, you should be able to complete the sentence that the artist didn't finish. You should feel like you're part of the co-production of meaning, and that you too are producing knowledge through your experience in the space. And the only way that I think, one of the ways that I think that can happen, is by intentionally leaving these gaps in the work that are not just gaps just because you didn't want to finish something, but gaps that are really about, like, I don't want to finish my sentence here because I really want to hear what you have to say about it. So what does that look like in art, to intentionally leave these gaps that are invitations for other people to co-produce meaning with you, to play with you, even if you're not physically there, to play with the thing on the wall that you put up, or the thing on the floor that is laying there. But again, thinking about this language of invitation. And I was talking to students, I was a quick critic up at Yale yesterday, the day before, and one of the things I was talking to students about was sort of what I'm calling the pitch of your invitation. So to what extent is this a loud invitation where I'm like sort of shouting at folks, being like, please come play? And to what extent is it a more of a quiet invitation where it's implicit, where it's implied or it's implicit that I want folks to engage with the work? And I always want folks to engage with the work, but I definitely think the pitch of different works implies or encourages a different type of relationality to the work and to the process and to the space.
Well, I want to say one other thing, and actually ask Camila you a question. The project that I've been developing for Front has actually been a new project for me. It's in collaboration with the artist Tony Cokes, and I have had the pleasure of thinking about the problem of reading and writing. And reading and writing is something I don't often consider, and the possibility of thinking of inserting the power, or allowing the inhabitant of a space to shuffle language, to reshape language, to redact language, is really exciting. And I'm wondering if you have anything to say about that, as it's a new terrain for me.
Yeah, I mean, I have lots to say about reading and revision. I mean, I always tell this story, and we spoke about this a little bit before, which is I published this book, No New Theories, in 2018, was super hyped and excited about it. Later, as I opened the books, realized that there were some errors, and I flipped out because I know at the time that this occurred, while I was speaking a lot about contingency and uncertainty and revision and learning, those things that were important to me as art concepts had not been integrated into like my lived life and ethos, which meant that when I got the book that was not in the form that I expected it to be, I had to actually figure out what was at the root of that and then how do I move forward. So we got to republish the book in 2019. We basically leaned into the process of acknowledging that indeed this is the second edition of the same book by working through this process of annotating the original text heavily. And part of that had to do with this notion that no text is ever final. And Umberto Eco talks about this quite frequently when he talks about the role of the reader. He talks about inferential walks. So like as we're reading a text, our inferential walks send us to all these different associations we're making alongside or with or through the text, right? And he also talks about ghost chapters. So each time we read a chapter, we create our own ghost chapter, right? It's not something that's committed to paper, but through our interpretations, through our misreadings, through our mistranslations, through that entire cognitive, spiritual, social reading process, we are creating another chapter, sentence, word, phrase that haunts the original. And so I am now very open to revision and contingency, and most of my shows are sort of organized around something changing or tweaking over time, or working with materials that will intentionally change themselves over time, because I'm interested in both the chemical reaction of those things, but also in just the nature that nothing is static, including my sense making of the world. And so I think that it's really scary to invite other people to undo the text that you have done. And it's also very scary to think about putting something out into the world that as soon as it is printed is anachronistic and will require some type of revision. But what I have found to be the most powerful part of that sort of surrendering is that I definitely believe that there are some really brilliant people out in the world. And so I always am excited when people come to my work and share with me a misreading, or share with me how they've shuffled the language of my show to make something else, or share it with me how they took the sentence and like went home and did something with it. All those moments actually feel like, I think that, let me back up. I think there's lots of ways that artists are sort of expected to measure and to make sense of their success. And so in trying not to put myself in the context of chasing awards, chasing accolades, one of the ways that I think about success is to what extent do people feel a sense of license to engage with my work as a co-thinker, co-learner, co-producer. So whenever I see people get very close to my work, or whenever people feel okay with talking to me about how they change something or make suggestions about things or suggest words get moved around, that feels like a moment of success. And so I think it is scary terrain because it's scary for the text to be completely undone. But I've gotten such beautiful responses from people in terms of how they've taken something that I thought was just sort of like a seed of something and turned it into a beautiful entire forest. And I think thinking about things ecosystemically and thinking about the language of ecology and livingness, there's something beautiful about creating something that gives life to something else in terms of artwork and language. You make a sentence and that sentence will birth other sentences. And there's sort of this self-replication that I think can be really generative and sort of a reminder of our connectedness.
Can I just ask one thing specifically based on that? Because this idea of language as generative, this idea of the way that people pick up a prompt that you have put forward and then continue it into another form, it seems also it's directly related to the project that you're doing for Front, also with the Cleveland Public Library and with all of these teenagers. I'm curious how that process of working with them in this mode of listening, how has the process as you envisioned it changed over the last couple of years of being in dialogue with Front, with the library, with people in Cleveland? How have the parameters shifted?
Yeah, so I, in collaborative sort of context now, one of the things that's most important for me is to recede a bit. And by that, I mean that I feel very privileged in that people have taken chances on me. People have displayed my work. People have given me grants. I feel very grateful for that. And I think about collaborative work in this way of like, where can I sort of displace myself and remove myself from the center to amplify? And I'm not amplifying. And I'm always trying to figure out the language around this. I'm not empowering. I'm not amplifying. I'm not doing any of those things. That's not me. I think it's basically trying to figure out how to get out of the way so that other people can take up the space they deserve to say what they need to say. And so I think that when we originally started thinking about Front, there are all these pieces that heavily relied on me producing a lot, which I was perfectly fine with. And I think that as we started working with the teams and sort of like visiting Cleveland, I don't know how many times I've been in Cleveland at this point, but always a good time, recognizing the importance of actually taking a step back to say a couple of things. Hey, Keela, you're not from Cleveland. There's that. Secondly, are there other people in Cleveland that have really important things to say that may not have the opportunity to say them because they don't have access to networks, people, capital in order to do that? And then thirdly, how can I take a step back to make some parts of that possible? And so in working with the teams, a lot of our time together is not making work. A lot of our time together is literally just listening to them tell stories and talk about their life and what they ate and all these other just really beautiful things that made me love being a high school teacher so much, which is like spending time with people, being in community with people. And I think that because there's so much push for productivity, not from Front, but just as a general concept right now, even in the middle of a pandemic, a push for productivity, what's been really great is sort of the space that Front has allowed for us to use this time to build relationships. Of course, we're going to make work together, but prioritizing the development of sustainable and real authentic relationships has been at the forefront. And so I think I'm excited about storing the stacks where people will receive scores and be able to then go and shuffle language and move things around and do public programming. And I'm excited about the public art product. We're working with the teams at 131st. I'm excited about all those things, but I think as cheesy as it sounds, it's been really great just to like get to know Cleveland a little bit better, get to know like a core group of young people and to actually just like work with folks in Cleveland on the ground for this project, because is really allowing me to listen and to take a step back and to remove myself from the center of the work.
Thank you. And I wanted to pick up something from what you said. I mean, Camila, you mentioned that for you, something that might be the hallmark of, let's call it success in the work, is to what extent is it picked up by other people? To what extent is it kind of continued through the next step that somebody who encounters your work brings? And I'm curious, Sarah, if in thinking about your most recent work and Sensitive Machines, how do you think about the intentionality of it, and what would be the kind of results? You've been working for years on this project with Tony in Front, that'll be in Transformer Station. What for you would you like to come out of that?
Well, I'm really excited about the unknown in this project. I believe that a lot of my work has dealt with the possibility of manipulating both the relationships between people, but also the relationships between people and the changing conditions of a building. And one of the primary changing conditions, whether we are aware of it or not, is light. And in the case of Tony's work, light is the vehicle. It's the vehicle for language. It's the vehicle for actually legibility. And the project that we have been developing is actually about allowing the visitors to the exhibition to manipulate the light source and manipulate the projection screen such that there is a reconfiguration of language in the space, a reconfiguration of light in the space, and a possibility of shifting the temporality of language so that meaning starts to, as Camila, as you were saying, a kind of shuffling of meaning. And it also then poses this very complicated question that I'm extremely excited about reading and writing. So not only are we reading language, but we are writing language in our motion. And so there's a kind of somatic relationship to the legibility of both a text and the legibility of space and the legibility of ourselves to each other. And all of these things create a huge sort of unknown. And I'm extremely excited to learn from that process.
Thank you. I mean, I will say there are so many more questions. I have 100 questions for each of you, but we're also, I don't know, 50, 60 people in a room with other questions. So I want to actually pivot for a moment. I want to invite anybody to stand up with me if you like. And I'd like to take a moment, almost as an interlude, to allow a different level of dialogue to happen. In the spirit of what you were talking about, transforming light, space, even people, please, if you'd like, stand up. I invite you to stand up and just take a look around you. Maybe look to your side, look behind you, and see if you can make eye contact with somebody whom you don't already know. Just take a moment and make eye contact with somebody you don't already know. And if you make eye contact with them, just move towards them. Pick up your things and just take a step towards them. One step. And just take a moment, we'll just take a couple of minutes to see what has come up for you in this. What are the questions you have? What are the things that stuck with you? And we can chat for a couple of minutes and then we'll come back and we can direct questions to Camila and Sarah before we end our little gathering today. So, yeah.
Right about now, you're about to be possessed by the sounds of MC Rawface and DJ Easy Rock. Hit it!
To get down, I'm not internationally known, but I'm known to rock the microphone because I get stupid, I mean outrageous. Stay away from me if you're contagious, cause I'm a winner, no not a loser. To be an MC is what I choose. Ladies love me, girls adore me, I mean even the ones who never saw me, like the way that I rhyme at a show. The reason why, man, I don't know, so let's go, cause
Okay, everyone. Great. So that was just a little interlude, but hopefully an opportunity to maybe make a new conversation, a new connection. Now, I'd love to come back to Camila and Sarah and take any questions that might be coming up for you, or even, if not questions, just impressions, thoughts, how you feel, where this has moved you. Everything is open here. So, Jamie has a mic and can hand it around for anybody who wants to.
Can I? Yeah, okay. Hi. Thank you so much for this wonderful talk. I actually have a question for Sarah, and I was talking to somebody. I was talking to Emma right here about your comment that you made about your project, The Sensitive Machine. And you said that you had these inquiries that you were pursuing, and I think my question was about that, especially the inquiries that drew you close to investigate the collective self, and how these inquiries kind of started and how they changed along the way, or if they have changed in any way.
So I really appreciate your question. And I think that these inquiries have grown quite incrementally. I have been very interested in thresholds for many, many years. And one of the things that I've noted through this process of interest is that a threshold is a navigation. It's a bodily navigation with a building that's very intimate, and it's a very tactile relationship. And it becomes a social relationship because we're also constantly sort of sensing those around us as we navigate the built environment. And I believe a really pivotal moment in this process of developing Sensitive Machine and developing my interest in networks and sort of interconnected nodes grew out of a project that I worked on with an extraordinary curator who happens to be in the room right now, Renee Morales, at the Perez Art Museum. And this was the first piece that I made where the work was actually tactilely manipulated. And in the process of developing that piece, and actually after that piece was developed, it was really an extraordinary experience to watch how the work became a medium through which connection occurred. And I think it was through the making and the learning from the making and the observing the behaviors around the making that Sensitive Machine evolved and the interest evolved of this kind of prosthetic extension of a collective self.
Thank you so much for the question. Are there other questions, comments, observations, feelings? We have something over here.
Good afternoon. My question is for Camilla. I was wondering how being born and raised in Silicon Valley impacted the things that you do today, the artistic practice, the interesting in pedagogy, all of that. How did that, especially for an African-American woman and being Muslim, how did that impact your practice?
Thank you for your question. And I always make this correction because I always say East Palo Alto existed before Silicon Valley existed. I'm from a small town called East Palo Alto, and the reason why I'm always so compulsive about noting that is that my city is a small city. And before it actually was incorporated as a full city in 1983, it was basically a city run by a bunch of really experimental and adventurous folks of color who wanted to do everything from renaming the city to Nairobi to starting a K through 14 school system, which ended up being one of the only Black-run school systems in the country at the time. And so I grew up shortly after those schools had closed, but I grew up sort of having the benefit of sort of that experimental spirit as part of my sort of schooling experience. So even though our city was quite poor, a couple of things that I had exposure to that really shaped who I am included, there's a publishing center. This publishing center was just an older woman in a trailer. And during lunchtime, you could either go outside and play, or you could go to her and have her bind your books and type your books up. And of course, I went to hang out with her. I was there all the time. And before I left second grade, I had published over half a dozen books. I had author readings where people would come and listen to me talk about my first plane ride, just nonsense now that I think about it, because what do I know at 6 or 7? So I feel very grateful that I grew up in a community that, while it lacked financial resources, had a lot of strong community ethos. And the fact that adults came to listen to me at 6 and 7 years old talk about my book, I think that I've always felt confident as a person who was able to not only read about the worlds that other people were creating, but to be able to actually create them, because I had people in my life early on who actually said, yeah, like, you're going to make a book and people are going to read it and we're going to make it available to people. So there's that. And I think also I had a teacher, Mr. Barksdale, who I've been looking for like the past decade. He was my science teacher, and he was the first Black scientist I ever met, and was the only Black science teacher I ever had my entire primary and secondary experience. And it was amazing to meet him because he realized that I was really bored in class, and he basically put me in advanced science classes and would take me to go collect water samples and let me order things from the catalog to do experiments. And so I feel in a lot of ways, again, even though our city didn't have a lot in terms of financial resources, I was exposed to this like very deep and interdisciplinary upbringing where I was sort of encouraged to explore many things and was trusted to explore these things. And I guess the last part of that I'll add is that in addition to those two experiences, I also, because it became known as Silicon Valley later, was part of a program called Plugged In, which was a coding program for like tweens and teens. So I've been coding since the age of like 12 or 13. And this is back in the late 90s, mid-late 90s, where I was just like doing HTML and CSS for like local companies and their websites. But like, again, by the time I was 13, I had a sort of a rich set of experiences that sort of exposed me to all these different ways of being in the world and expressing myself and thinking about knowledge production. Even if I wasn't using that sophisticated language, I knew at a very young age that I had the right to assert things about the world, and I have the right to make things and to question and challenge things. And so in a lot of ways, I'm very grateful to my parents, obviously, but also grateful for the legacy of my city of East Palo Alto for sort of creating these very, very clear opportunities for me to play as a learner, and for me to consider play to be the central part of learning, not the thing you get to do once you do all the other stuff. Like, play is the learning, not the thing after the learning, but it is the learning. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you so much. Do we have other questions, thoughts, comments? Oh, I see one over here.
Hi, I wanted to ask, how do artists and also teachers make space for accessibility in the classroom and in other spaces? How do we make those minorities or people who might not be included in the learning more accessible through play?
I can't see if Sarah is motioning, so I'm just sitting here. Sarah, did you want to say something?
By all means, go ahead, Camila.
Okay, sorry. I just didn't want to. I can't see anything. So yeah, so when we were doing the project, Scoring the Stacks at Brooklyn Public Library, Cora Cora was the curator, now a friend. We talked a lot about accessibility because one of the things that we said is that we want to ensure that as many people as possible can access it, but at the same time, we didn't really want to be presumptuous in terms of like what people actually needed. And so the way that I think about accessibility now in this context is, again, around listening, right? There are obviously the mandated things you're supposed to do as an educator, right? If a student, if you're in a high school context, if a student has an IEP or a 504 plan, legally you're required to do certain things. In college and secondary, post-secondary settings, again, a student can come in with a list of accommodations that you are legally required to accommodate, right? I would like to move the conversation of accessibility away from doing things because you're legally compelled to do them to doing them because you actually believe that everyone should be included in the process of play and learning, right? And so I think part of that is actually checking in with the folks in your classroom to actually figure out what are your accessibility needs that actually exceeds sort of the bureaucratic articulation of what you should receive, right? So an IEP or a 504 plan might say that this person is required to get double time on an exam. Sure, that may be one accommodation or that provides access. But another thing to think about is like asking the student, like, actually, what do you need? Like, advocate for yourself. What do you actually need in order to ensure that this learning experience is one that is both beneficial and generative and feels inclusive? I think when it comes to elements of play, one of the things that I think about a lot is how play is such, it's intuitive. Which means there's no wrong way to play, right? And so I think that one area of accessibility that I am really interested in is sort of like using prompts or challenges as a starting place. So, for example, in a Cooper class last week or 2 weeks ago, we've been thinking about how to design activities for a range of learners. And so I asked for them to take 15 minutes in a group of 3 to come up with an art activity that leaves behind no material trace. And the purpose of that was that I just want you guys to play for 15 minutes to figure out what is an art activity that will leave no trace, right? Discuss it, figure it out. You're going to share back to the rest of us what you came up with. I really like activities like this because there's no right answer, but also it encourages folks to sort of construct meaning with one another in a collective context versus me telling you what you should get out of this. I'm asking for you to play as a form of knowledge production and to use that play in our future conversations as a way to continuously revise your thinking. So I think accessibility is about a mindfulness around different bodies in space, but also around different cognitions, but also an awareness that all of us are not learning in a way where we are taking information directly from someone else and then making sense of it. A lot of us need to be in our bodies and to actually play with ideas, play with objects, play with sounds, play with smells, play with moments, play with other people in order to make sense of learning. And so thinking about all the sort of marginal ways in which we think about learning, which are at the root of many marginalized communities, which are around play and song, and bringing those back to the center versus being marginal pedagogies.
Thank you. So I think we probably have maybe time for one more question. Is there anybody else who would like to question, comment? Can't see with the light. If not, then maybe we'll take that as prompt to pause and say thank you to Camila and Sarah for engaging in this fantastic conversation across space and time, and to all of you for coming here and being part of this. And again, I'll just say I hope you'll have a chance to go visit the front booth at 287, all the way in the back, to learn more about the show. Hopefully, we'll see some of you in Cleveland between July and October of 2022, or also across these distributed modes, online or in some other way. It's been wonderful to share space with everyone, and let's have a round of applause for these great humans.